We're going to add axis labels. So that is the x-axis label down here in the bottom and the y-axis label on the side. This lets us actually know what the axes mean. This scales and axes example is not really complete because it doesn't have axis labels. There are tick marks and numbers, but it doesn't really complete the idea of ascribing meaning to x and y because it doesn't label them. I would like to add an x-axis label right here and a y-axis label right here. I'll start by forking this viz and call it axis labels. When we invoke our viz, I would like to be able to specify x-axis label to be a string, and the same for y. And then in our viz function, we can destructure those options. And then alongside our group elements, we can put the axis labels. So I'll start by saying svg.selectAll text, because I want these to be svg text elements. And I'll give it a class of x-axis label, because I know we're going to run into the same issue as we did with the group elements where we need to disambiguate between two different text elements. And we can use the same pattern of .data null to make a single text element. .join text, set the class to be x-axis label, and then set the text content to be x-axis label. To make this appear in the center, we can set the x attribute to be width divided by 2. And then to make it appear at the bottom, we can set the y attribute to be height minus margin bottom. And there it is, x-axis label. This x-coordinate actually determines the starting point of the text, but I'd like it to define the middle point. To do that, we can use text anchor set to middle, and now it lines up in the middle. And then I'd like to push it down into this empty space here, which we can do by adding a number to the y-coordinate that I'll call x-axis label offset. And that is something we can add to our options, and we're going to need that for y, so I might as well add that too. And then let's configure that to be, I don't know, 10. And now it's moved down a little bit, and we can tweak this further to move this into exactly the right position. All right, I don't really like that font. This is the default serif font. So let me set the font family to be sans serif. And that looks a little different, a little nicer. Okay, that's how you make an x-axis label. Now let's do the same thing for the y-axis. This will be a little tricky because we're going to have to rotate it. At least that's how I like to make these. All right, so let's start by saying svg.selectAll text.y axis label, and with a similar pattern, but this time we apply transform rotate minus 90. Now I'm not sure if that is quite exactly right because it's rotating, see, along this point in the corner. That's not what we want here. To fix this, we can specify x and y in the transform itself. Transform is translate by y-axis label offset and then height over 2 to put it in the middle, and then rotate minus 90. Now this isn't working because I don't think I've actually specified a value. Yeah. So let me define y-axis label offset to be something like 30, and there it is. All right. Let me tweak that to get it to look exactly right. And there we have it. There's our y-axis label. All right, that's how you can add axis labels. To recap what we did here, we added some more options for x-axis label and y-axis label, and then the offsets for these. And then in viz.js, we destructure those options, and then we added some logic for defining these text labels. We use classes to differentiate between these two different text elements. And for x, we just use the x and y properties of the text element to position it. Width over 2 puts it in the middle. Height minus margin bottom puts it at the bottom. And then we add x-axis label offset, which is the distance from the axis line itself. We set text anchor middle so that the x-coordinate defines the center point of the text, not the left side. And then we just set the font family to be sans serif so that it's a little nicer font than the default. And finally, we pass the x-axis label as the text. Now for the y-axis label, here, let me delete this dead code. It's pretty much the same, but it's a little more complicated because we rotate it by 90 degrees. Now, because axis labels are such a common need, and I don't want to have to sort of cargo cult copy this code between all the vizzes that I make that have axis labels, I'm going to encapsulate axes and labels into functions that I can export from this viz and import in other vizzes. This viz function is getting pretty long, and there's a lot of code to do with axis labels. So let me just segment this off. This is axis labels, and then these two are the actual axes. And similarly to the way that the viz function is set up, we can define another module called axes.js. And this can have a similar structure to viz. I'll just rename it to be axes. Or, better yet, let me actually make separate ones for x-axis and y-axis. So this will be x-axis. It'll take as input an SVG, and we'll see what else we need. But this will be a function that will do this stuff here. So I'm just going to move that code over here, and we're going to need height, margin bottom, and x scale, which we can destructure like that. And then we need to import axis bottom from D3, and I'll remove that import from viz.js. Okay, this is a function that encapsulates the behavior of rendering an axis. Now we just need to import this from ./x-axis. And then we just need to invoke it with the proper arguments, namely SVG and these three things: height, margin, bottom, and x scale. So I'll just paste that right there. And if I refresh the page, it still works. That's great. All right, that's how you can refactor to split out a function that does a certain thing, like the x scale. Let's do the same for y. I'll make a new file, y-axis.js. I'm going to copy paste x-axis and just change the name to y, and change axis bottom to axis left. And then let me grab that logic from viz.js and drop that right in here. And that will reveal that we need margin left, not margin bottom, and y scale, not x scale. And we don't need height. So there is our y-axis function. Just need to invoke it with the proper arguments, and also import y-axis from ./y-axis. And then we call y-axis passing SVG and these various arguments. And it still seems to work. Now let's do the same for x-axis label. Export const x-axis label, is a function that takes SVG and some options and does something, and I'll grab that logic from here. That reveals that we need width, height, margin bottom, and x-axis label offset. Oh, and also x-axis label. And there's our x-axis label function. Now we need to import that, like so, and invoke it. And I'll just grab these arguments and paste it right here. That broke. Let me see what happened. X-axis label is not a function. Why is that? It's being exported. It's being imported. Oh, it's the same name. Okay. Let me call this x-axis label text. Now we need to redo the arguments here. Call it x-axis label text, and then invoke that with x-axis label text. And finally, we need to pass it in there. And there it is. It works. All right, I'm going to do the same for y-axis label. And then I'll grab this logic from here and put that into y-axis label, which reveals that we need y-axis label offset, height, and y-axis label text. So I'll add that here. And then we just need to import that here from /y-axis label and then invoke it and pass in the right arguments. And again, we're going to have to rename the argument for the text to be y-axis label text, and then in index.js, update that argument as well. And there it is. It worked. Okay, great. Now the last step here, which will enable us to reuse these functions across vizzes, is that in index.js, we can say export all of these things. Instead of importing, we export x-axis, y-axis, x-axis label, and y-axis label. And last but not least, let me change the custom URL to be axis-labels. All right. That's how you can refactor things and export functions from vizzes so that you can import them in other vizzes later on, and you don't have to copy paste all the code around all the time.